Hey, this video is about the 5 most rare and unusual super telephoto lenses I've used throughout my career. Let's get started. One of the most rare lenses I've ever shot with, I got to use in college when I was a student at Marquette University. They had a little group called the Instructional Media Center, which was sort of I don't know why it was called that, but that's where the photographers were. There were 2 full-time shooters there, and at some point in the past, the decision had been made to make the house or the shop all Olympus. And so my first experience with long glass, using really fast long lenses, was with Olympus. And a lot of people don't have any idea that Olympus has a really huge background in making professional high-end long glass, fast glass. They have 3 lenses that are really interesting. The first of which is, it's more common than the other 2, but the first one is the 180 f2. So it's a 180mm f2.0. This lens was incredibly small and compact, as were all Olympus lenses and cameras of the day. Back in the 90s, Olympus really was making fantastic gear, as was Minolta, but it didn't really matter because Nikon had been emerging from the 80s as the clear leader for pro cameras, people shooting with their gear. And then Canon came in the very late 80s with EOS, and that became obviously the market leader within just a few years. But Olympus was a really legitimate outfit, and they made these 3 lenses. So the 180 f2 was one. They made a 250mm f2.0. And this is a lens I got to shoot with at Marquette when I was a student. I would get to go take it on assignment to shoot maybe a professor doing a class or whatever, but it was really fun to use that lens. Olympus also made a lens called the 350mm 2.8. Now, no one has made lenses like these 2, in particular the 250 f2 and the 350 2.8. These remain unique to Olympus OM back from the 90s. They were fantastic lenses. They were incredibly sharp. They wouldn't be as good as what we have today with purple fringing and moire and all that kind of stuff, but they were really great for film back in the day. So I really appreciated being able to use those lenses when I was a kid. It was really cool. And I can still remember being so amazed at what my film looked like when I was making prints that were shot, pictures that were shot with the 250 f2 especially. It was so incredible to see how beautiful the lack of depth of field was, bokeh, whatever. So the first 2 were the 250 f2 and the 350 2.8. I put those together. The second lens that I got to use was a little further along in my career when I was out of newspapers and was working for Sports Illustrated. I got an assignment to shoot at Austin Peay University, which is over near Nashville. And the story was about an African-American baseball player who had grown up there in that town and was now a starting pitcher. He was like the varsity starting pitcher for the baseball team. The trick is the lighting there was really terrible, and their home colors were black, and this was a very dark complected black kid. And so I knew I was in trouble because this is before digital ever happened. This is probably, I would say 96, 97, somewhere in there. And there just was no light, and I had to shoot this kid at a night baseball game. And again, it was very poorly lit, so it was really it was like a triple whammy against me. And so I called Mel Levine in the Sports Illustrated building in New York, and I said, Mel, I need the 300 f2. And he fought me a little bit, knew I was a Canon guy, and I said, yeah, I need a camera, I need a Nikon camera body, and I need the 300mm f2. Now, the 300 f2 is an incredibly rare lens for a very interesting reason now. Nikon only made that lens for, I believe, 3 or 4 years. And it was an Olympic lens. It was a lens made for the Olympics. It was something they did because they could. And if memory serves, what happened is if you wanted to buy a 300 f2, what you had to do is go to a Nikon Pro dealer you had to pay half down. They would build it, and then they'd ship it, and then you had to pay the other half when you picked the lens up at the dealer. This would take, a couple of months to get one. That was a really cool lens. And a lot of people don't know, many people have seen the 300 f2 in use at games back in the day. And this, of course, is when we shot all slide film for color, at Sports Illustrated. And so at really, really dark stadiums, we would have to get these out. The early domes were really challenging for getting good quality color images. I can remember the Georgia Dome when they built it. It was really, really terrible. Anyway, the 300 f2 was a really great solution for like Texas Stadium, the old Texas Stadium, for the end zones, because it was so dark in the end zones. It was away from the light that was pooling in the middle of the field. The 300 f2 was a great example of something you could use. And that shoot, by the way, was successful at Austin Peay. I was able to get that job done, and they had plenty of images on the negative to get that going. I did have to shoot colored negative film. I think it was the only time. It was one of the only times I ever shot colored neg film for Sports Illustrated back in the day. So one last thought about the 300 f2 and why they're so incredibly rare now is that the Hollywood studios bought almost every copy of the 300 f2 that was available. Anytime one came up for sale at KEH or, from whoever, I actually sold a number of them through a company called PhotoFax that I had in the 90s. But what would happen is they would go and get shipped to Los Angeles. They would get put into like a shop. They would cut the back of the lens off, literally, and then they would put a PL mount on it for motion picture cameras. And so these lenses are used. You have been seeing lenses for your whole life shot with a 300 f2, but you just didn't know it was a 300 f2. But it's a wonderful way for motion picture directors to make two people talking with a complete blown out background. And so this is where you see it employed a lot. And so the 300 f2s are almost all in Hollywood or in rental companies around the world. But that's what happened to most of them. And so nowadays, to find a 300 f2 Nikkor lens with an actual Nikon mount is really, really rare and unusual. When it shipped from Nikon through NPS, you had to be a Nikon Pro Service member to even buy one, by the way. You couldn't just be a rich guy and get one. But what they did is they shipped it with a teleconverter that was unique to that lens. And this was a TC14C. And this remains to be the most rare teleconverter ever made by any camera manufacturer. The TC14C is a teleconverter that was sharper than the TC14B of its era. And many high-end sports photographers back in the 80s and 90s figured this out, and they got hold of used teleconverters, the TC14Cs. They are incredibly rare. They're worth, $1,500 to $2,000 nowadays, if you can find one. A lot of those ended up in Japan with collectors when times were good in Japan. And every once in a while, maybe every 5 or 6 years, I'll see one pop up on eBay. It's really, there's a lot of people that write messages and say, hey, I think you meant TC14B. And they're like, no, it's a C. The C had larger glass in it in the middle to accommodate the more light that was coming through the 300 f2 that would hit the film plane. Anyway, that's it for the 300 f2. Amazing lens. I'm glad to have actually gotten to shoot with one. Mel Levine at SI used to joke that the lens was a small price to pay to get one, because later on they were worth $7,000, $8,000 and even $10,000 and beyond. But the FedEx charges to ship one two ways between New York and wherever you needed it as a shooter was astronomical because of its weight and its value. The last lens that I got to use one time was made by Canon, actually. It was the 1200mm 5.6L EOS lens. Peter Reed Miller is a dear friend of mine, and he had gotten an assignment to shoot a Tennessee Vols game here in Knoxville. And being the good buddy that he is, he had SI ship me the lens, I think on Monday before a Saturday game, which gave me a whole week to fool with it. And it was so much fun. That lens was truly remarkable. And earlier in the day, that was a day game, but I was able to shoot a really early morning start game down at Maryville College, and I was able to shoot that thing on a monopod. It was sort of recommended to use a tripod, but you know, I was dumb and stupid, and actually that's what we did, football games, when it was in use. But it was a fantastic lens. It was unbelievably heavy and big. It came in a huge flight case, an Anvil flight case, and again, incredibly, just excruciatingly expensive to ship around the country. So I was very, very lucky that my friend Peter kind of thought enough of me to get, you know, he sent me the lens. He's smart though, because he didn't have to deal with it at the airport. He just shipped it to me, and then I showed up at the game with it. So he's a very smart friend of mine. But anyway, that was an amazing adventure that week. I remember shooting some birds with it. I shot some track and field. I went out and they were practicing. But it was so amazing to be able to isolate backgrounds, and just, anything you pointed that thing at made eye candy. It was a remarkable lens to use. The last lens is also a Nikkor lens. It's a very rare lens, not as rare as a 300 f2, but this is a Catadioptric lens, or a mirror lens. And for a very short period of time, Nikon made a 500mm f5.0 lens. Now, to kind of remind you how fast that is, you know, 5.6 is a lens, is an aperture where most people are, you know, it's a normal aperture. 5.0 is faster than 5.6. It's above 4.5. So this was an incredibly fast lens in its era. And these lenses are very, very sharp lenses. Now, the Catadioptric lenses, all of them, or mirror lenses as they're called, have a unique attribute that's really interesting, and that is that they have more accurate color than any other type of lens. So the color coming from a Catadioptric lens is really unique. It's a very beautiful quality to see that. The other unique thing about the Cat lenses is that they produce little donuts in the background. So all the highlights that would be in the background, the internal elements of the mirrors and stuff that's inside the Catadioptric lenses, the mirror lenses, produced a weird bokeh that had little circles in the background. So every once in a while you'll see a picture from the 60s and the 70s from like football games or whatever, Sports Illustrated or other of that same era, and you'll see these little donuts in the background, and they're kind of cool. It's kind of a neat thing. I actually owned a 500 f5 lens, but I sold it to my friend Peter Miller, I don't know, about 15 years ago. I've regretted that. I wish I'd never done that. I wish I had it back. These are rare, but they're not incredibly rare like the 300 f2. They can be found on eBay, you know, once or twice a year. One will pop up, and they'll sell anywhere between like $650 and $1,000 or so. But really cool lens. It's a great birder lens if you are don't have a lot of money, but you really need a true telephoto that's fast. This is a great way to get one, is to get the 500 f5 Nikkor lens. That's it for this episode of looking back, and I think it's the first video I've ever made that doesn't involve Sony, but that's okay. My life has included, you know, a lot more than just Sony, and so I hope you found this enjoyable. Please hit the like or subscribe button down below if you enjoyed this. Thanks so much for watching on PMR.